Paul has met with the elders of the church in Jerusalem, and on their advice, he has gone to the temple. But at the temple, a false accusation has been leveled against him, and it runs along these lines. This man Paul is such a lover of Gentiles that he even brought a Gentile into the holy place. Now, it's worth pointing out here that the Jews worshipped the temple. Now, of course, they wouldn't say that, but it's clear that they made an idol out of the temple itself. Both Jesus and Stephen, the first martyr, lost their lives on the basis of that accusation, that they spoke against the temple. Here, a riot breaks out, and this riot reaches the ears of the Roman commander, who comes in and arrests Paul. There are a couple of interesting details here. Firstly, this temple had been renovated and expanded as one of the many building projects of Herod the Great. He thought that he could get the Jews to love him by effectively buying their allegiance, by footing the bill for the temple construction. He wanted to please the Jews. However, he also wanted to please the Romans. That was literally his job as the middleman between them. And so the second structure he had built was right next to the temple. It was called the Antonia Fortress, and it literally overlooked the temple courts. So the Romans could see everything going on in the temple, and particularly during the major Jewish festivals. That fortress would be stacked full of Roman soldiers to prevent an uprising before it could get going. So Paul is being carried up the steps to the fortress, which is right next door to the temple, and he manages to persuade the commander to let him address the crowd. And upon receiving his permission, Paul begins to speak, standing on the fortress steps, and the people quieten down to listen. "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense," Paul says. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. And so Paul begins to share his testimony here. It would be fascinating to look through the various sermons of the Apostle Paul, because we've seen him use a variety of approaches depending on the audience and the context. When he's preaching evangelistically to the Jews, he will often start with Father Abraham and trace the promises of Judaism to their fulfillment in Jesus. When he's preaching to the Gentiles, he will often start with the God of creation. Here, he is making a defense of his beliefs, and he tells his personal testimony. Now, I've got to tell you, my personal testimony is about as run-of-the-mill, unspectacular as you could possibly get. I was raised by Christian parents, taken to church every week, heard the gospel faithfully preached, and responded when I was 7 or 8 years old. Somebody once asked me how I got saved, and I shared that story, telling them, it's not all that spectacular, but here it is. And they quite rightly brought me up short and said, "Jimmy, you were raised from death to life. How is that not spectacular?" And that's very true. When I was young, I kind of wished that I had a more dramatic testimony, a more exciting story to share. The older I've got, the more grateful I've become, actually, that the Lord spared me so many sorrows by saving me young. And now my genuine prayer for my kids and for everyone that I know is that the Lord will save them sooner rather than later, that they might have more time devoted to enjoying him and serving him this side of eternity. Still, you have a testimony. I have a testimony. Paul has a testimony, a story of what God has done in our lives. And there's beautiful diversity in hearing lots of these stories. And there's also beautiful unity, because here's what they all come down to. I was blind, but now I see. I was lost, now I'm found. I was dead, now I am alive. Paul, for his part, was literally blind. And he shares the story here of how his physical eyes were closed, but his spiritual eyes were opened. When he was blind, he called out, "Who are you?" And the response came back, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting." Paul, as we know from Acts chapter 9, believed, was baptized, and was immediately called into the service of the Lord. That is the pattern that all Christians should seek to follow. Those who believe should be baptized in obedience to Christ, and those who obey in this thing should obey in all things, seeking to devote their whole lives to him. Paul says, "This is my story. This is what has happened to me, and here I am, seeking to devote my whole life to him. The Lord said to me, 'Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles.'" But of course, that is the key point of tension between Paul and those listening to this proclamation. Paul's great zeal, his love for the Gentiles. And so we read, The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him! He is not fit to live!" Paul's life is spared, at least at this point, by the Roman commander who orders that Paul be taken into the barracks, into the fortress behind him. And we'll pick up the story from there tomorrow. For now, though, notice the transformation that has taken place in this Paul's life. He's been given such a gift from God that whatever he loses, he counts it as overall gain. He has been given eternal life, which is so valuable that he's willing to lose his earthly life in the hope that others might hear the truth of his testimony of what the Lord has done for him.